Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Tonight was like any other night. James sat in the living room, facing the TV screen showing an old movie. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall, the sound of rain hitting the glass creating a monotonous and gloomy sound. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock. He was used to loneliness, because James lived alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old house outside, near midnight. James turned off the TV and returned to his bedroom. He picked up the phone on the bedside table, looked at the clock. It read 11:58 p.m. He felt tired, but not really sleepy. Every time it rained, he always felt like his bedroom was filled with a cold, clammy energy. When the clock hands pointed to 12 a.m., a ringing sound rang out. James looked down at the phone screen and it seemed to freeze. The words "incoming call, me" appeared on the screen. He froze, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. At first, James thought it was just a system error, but when the ringing sound continued, he knew something was wrong. His hands were shaking, and he wondered why he had seen his own name on the incoming call. It couldn't be a coincidence. The call continued. The sound of the late-night ringing in the room was sharp and crackling. James swallowed, his hand touching the screen. He wavered between answering and turning off the ringing, but the strange and somehow different feeling inside him pressed the answer button. A gap rang out. James pressed the phone to his ear, only hearing the sound of rain outside and a kind of soft whispering like wind. He said, "Hello, who's there?" The voice on the other end answered slowly, not quickly, but cold as ice. "It's me. It's James." His heart seemed to stop. For a moment, James wondered if someone was playing a prank or if someone had hacked his phone. But the voice, without a doubt, was his own. Every word, every note. "Why? Why'd you call me?" James asked, trembling. The voice laughed. "Don't ever answer the phone after midnight, especially when it's you. You don't want to know what happened next." The call ended. The screen returned to normal. James stared at the phone for a long time, his whole body cold and sweaty. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It all seemed like a real-life animated horror story, but it was reality. In the room, he felt the darkness spreading. The familiar house now felt as if someone was watching him. James tried to explain to himself that it was probably just a technical error, or his tired imagination. But then, when the clock read 12:15 a.m., the phone vibrated again. This time, the screen showed the same words, "Me calling." James felt his legs freeze. He waited, but this time, he didn't answer. The phone rang long and hard, the sound like a needle in your hand. When it was turned off, the room was plunged into a deafening silence. James lay down on the bed, closed his eyes, hoping it was all just a strange dream. But before he could fall asleep, a message appeared on the screen. He opened the phone and saw the simple words, "Next time, if you don't hear, I'll come." James felt the river shimmering. He glanced out the window. Outside, the rain was still falling, the darkness becoming more obscure than ever. In his mind, he knew that this story had only just begun, and what awaited him was even scarier than the last call, but only the intense darkness in this chilling scares story. Please continue watching episode 2 to know when James gets stuck deeper in this mystery. What terrible things await him? James woke up in the morning with a feeling as if someone had just sat at the foot of the bed. He turned his head to look around the room. Everything was quiet, but the air still filled him with a sense of darkness. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, but the sky was so dark that he felt an unusual energy permeate the entire house. He convinced himself that it was just the after effects of a long night of sleeplessness. But at the back of his mind, he could still feel the eyes staring at him. James made himself a cup of hot coffee, trying to get back to normal. But when he opened his phone, the screen was still filled with messages from yesterday. "Last time, if you don't hear, I'll come." He read it over and over again. Each word seemed different from the previous one. Who sent that message, and how could that voice be him? He knew he couldn't tell anyone this story, because they would think he'd lost his mind. The strange thing was that it didn't stop there. As he walked to work, James felt as if someone was following him. The shadows on the glass of the buildings seemed to move out of sync with him. When he got there, he saw in the rearview mirror of a car the voice from last night lingering in his head. "Don't miss the next call, ... By evening, it was starting to rain again. James opened the door, turned off the lights, and went to his bedroom. He put the phone on the bedside table and told himself that if he didn't answer, he would be safe. But it only made him more uneasy. At exactly 12 a.m., the phone screen lit up. "Mum calling" was clearly visible. James's heart was beating fast. His nerves were like a vacuum. He was determined not to answer the phone, just to stay still, hoping the call would stop. But to his dismay, the ringing continued for a long time, so long that it made his ears ache. The phone stopped ringing. James let out a soft sigh, but before he could calm down, a soft knock came from his own door. The knocking was steady and slow, like someone was announcing their presence. He turned to the window, but saw only rain outside. He almost froze as he looked at the apartment door. A shadow stood still, staring intently inside. James ran to get a free best bolt, his heart pounding rapidly. He tried to convince himself it was a dream, but when he opened the door, the hallway was filled with darkness and the smell of smoke. No one was there. He slammed the door shut, his heart still racing. When he returned to his bedroom, he found the phone screen lit up with a new recording. He trembled as he recognized it. It was his own voice, but not from him. The recording began in English. Then a voice whispered, "I'm here." James slammed the phone down, his heart about to explode. He didn't understand how a recording could appear when he wasn't paying attention. The house no longer felt safe. He realized that this story had spiraled out of control, turning into one of the most terrifying horror stories of his life. At nearly 1 a.m., James sat down in the corner of the room, his hands feeling the hot air. He did not dare to sleep, only listening to the sound of rain hitting the window and the occasional sound of a small gong in the water pipe. He felt like time was dragging on endlessly. Before dawn, he received another message. "You have chosen wrongly." At that moment, the lights in the room suddenly turned off, as if someone had just touched the switch. The whole room was completely dark. James sat motionless, not daring to breathe. Not only pushed James into a state of torment, but also opened up more terrifying questions. Who was ignoring these calls, and why did they know his every move? You should continue to follow episode 3 to find out how far the story will go. After Monday night, James felt tired and his mind was heavy. He wondered if he was losing his mind, but every detail was too clear for him to remember. Phone, calls, messages, recordings, all of them were there. That morning, James decided to take a day off and stay home, because he had no mind to face work. He sat in the living room, facing the window with the window half open. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw a dark shadow passing through the hallway. James turned around, but there was no one. He walked to every corner of the room, only to see the house in the empty space. But the feeling of being watched did not stop. Every time he turned around, James felt like he saw a shadow forming a person standing still at the end of the hallway in the evening. James decided to play the recording on his phone. He wanted to make sure he wasn't imagining it. In the audio file, the voice still echoed, "I'm here." But a moment later, there was a click and a faint laugh, like a spirit eating. James turned off the file, his hands shaking. Outside, the rain was starting to fall, but the lights in the house were off. James felt that the flickering sound was like a warning sign. He remembered the ghost stories he had heard from his elders since childhood, that if your phone called you back, it meant your spirit was trying to return. At 12 a.m., the phone vibrated again. This time, the screen didn't show me calling anymore, but only the words, "Answer me." James felt that something had changed. He knew that if he answered, something even worse would happen. But if he didn't, he was afraid that someone would appear before him like the message had warned him. James let the phone ring continuously. But this time, instead of turning off, it rang for more than 10 minutes, then suddenly stopped. A cold wind blew through the room, even though the window was closed. A whisper appeared, very close to his ear. "You're lying." James jumped up, turned around to look around the room, but there was no one. He felt nervous, moving slowly in the hallway. The ceiling light flickered and went out. In the complete darkness, he heard footsteps moving. The voices were not in sync with him, as if someone else was walking in step with him a few steps away as he approached his own door. James saw something strange appear on the glass. A face, looking exactly like his, but the eyes were as empty and cold as a corpse. James fell back in panic, the phone in his hand vibrating again. This time, the screen displayed the message, "I'm in your house." Heart pounding, James ran into the bedroom, the door. He curled up in his knees, like a second child. But in the space between sleep and sleep, he clearly heard his own voice rising from the head of the bed. "You can't escape me," at nearly 2 a.m. James opened his eyes, sweating as if he were in a trance. The house had become unusually quiet. He wondered if he should leave immediately, but it was as if something invisible was creeping in, keeping him from leaving this place. James was taken to a level 2 stage, where voices and projections began to merge. He was being sucked into a world where ghost stories became reality. You'll have to watch to see what happens as the truth is revealed layer by layer. Tuesday night came to James faster than he thought. After the horrors he had experienced, he had thought about leaving the apartment, but he had not had the courage. Something had kept him there, as if the apartment had become a flight that no one could escape. That night, James did not go inside the house. He just sat in the dark, watching the phone on the bedside table like a bomb about to explode. At 12 a.m., the phone screen lit up. This time, it was not me calling, but do not ignore. James knew he was not allowed to answer, but he was not allowed to ignore either. He felt that every choice was a mistake. The call was long, the ringing sound short and clear throughout the room, like the sound of himself calling. When James decided not to answer, the screen went off, but immediately after, his own voice rang out, steady as a test. Tink, tink, tink. James was about to ignore it, but then the footsteps in the hallway began to circle around. They were light, but they were definitely not his. He felt a chill approaching the door. The air was cold. The light in the house began to flicker. In the dim light, he saw his own shadow, but it was not in sync with him. The shadow moved on its own, turned toward the door, then disappeared into the hallway. James turned back to his bedroom, heart pounding, sweat running down his back. He closed the door again, but in the room, another sound appeared. The sound of a phone automatically playing a recording. James tried to turn it off, but it was too late. The voice on the audio file was his, but this time it was no longer a stubborn laugh. But in order, open the door, he hesitated, not obeying. The room was now a chorus of voices, and the silence was broken by the sounds of something on the floor, as if someone was pushing something heavy. James tried not to listen to the sounds, which grew louder and louder, and stopped right outside the bedroom door. He sat there, feeling the bitterness, the tension in the air. The darkness grew thicker. The air was cold as ice. Then a small laugh appeared right next to him. "You will not escape me." James began to cry in the silence, his eyes closed, his mind trapped in a loop. He wanted to run, wanted to walk, but his legs seemed to have no strength left. At 1 a.m., everything suddenly fell silent. The silence was even more terrifying than laughter or knocking. James fell into a deep sleep, and in his dream, he saw himself standing in the middle of the hallway, looking at himself with empty eyes, reaching out and whispering, "I told you. You shouldn't answer." When he woke up, James saw a new text message on his phone. "I'll come see you tomorrow." He shivered and put the phone down, feeling like he was living in a haunted story with no way out. Not only revealed the number of escalations, but also put James in a situation with no choice. Episode 5 will take the story further, when the real shape of each call begins to fade. The next morning, James sat in the living room with a blank look. He couldn't sleep, just staring at the phone screen, which still had the message, "I'll see you tomorrow." Each sentence was like a promise. His mind was in a panic. He thought about calling the police, but then wondered what he would say. That he got a call from himself in the middle of the night. That his shadow had moved on from him. No one would believe it. James drank one cup of coffee after another, his heart trying to steady itself, but his head was heavy. He looked around the room. Every familiar object now seemed like a sign of someone who was stealing it. The shadow of the table, the mirror hanging on the wall, all of it felt more than just an object. He recalled the scary stories he had read online as a child, about people who had been led to their deaths by a phone call. He had not believed those things before, but now they were becoming the reality he was living every minute as the sun began to set. James closed the window, turning off all lights. He decided not to let anything from the outside in. He cut the baseball tree right next to him, like a friend and ally. The clock slowly ticked to 12 a.m. The phone screen lit up, but this time it was not a call, but a new message. "I'm outside the door." His heart seemed to stop beating. James put the phone down, felt the phone, and walked closer to the door. He put his ear to the person. There was no sound. But when he looked down the crack of the door, he clearly saw a pair of legs. Someone was standing outside the door. The frightened man stepped back, his heart pounding. The doorbell rang. Every knock felt like a hammer in his chest. Thump, ... thump. James was pushed against a corner of the wall, not daring to get close. But then the knocking stopped abruptly. A vast space, except for the sound of rain outside. He thought he might have imagined it. But then the phone on the table rang, the screen displaying "Answer or I enter." James knew he had no choice. He picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end rang out, cold as ice. "I'm here." He felt the atmosphere in the room change, colder, heavier. James turned off the phone, ran to the bedroom, locked the door. He sat down in the corner of the bed, sweating coldly in the darkness. The sound of the tomb echoed throughout the room. "You can't move." James was frozen, not daring to move a muscle. He knew that something was no longer standing outside the door, but inside the house. He saw that the shadow on the wall was not his, but another shadow, standing still, looking at him. That the later it got, the more frightened everything became. The objects in the house began to move, as if someone else was sharing the apartment. The door slammed shut, the mirror shook, and the sound of laughter echoed throughout the room. James cried silently. His mind was shattered. He felt as if he no longer belonged to this world. Nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, all the sounds suddenly disappeared. The phone lit up again with a short message. "I'll see you tomorrow, in person." James looked at the screen, feeling his insides go cold. He realizes that this is only the beginning, and the worst is yet to come. James is on the verge of the second place, when word of the real appearance of the person is only a night away, will reveal the more terrifying truth about the shadow that is hiding behind him. The next day, James almost lost the ability to think normally. He did not go to work, did not answer any calls from his friends. His phone was just an object that he left on the table, with the promise that today would be the day to talk directly. He closed the door and looked out at the dark sky. The cold shadows in the house now seemed to have become a living creature, spreading everywhere. James decided to isolate himself, to make himself quiet to relieve the pressure. But every time he swept the floor or touched something, he felt as if someone was standing behind him, staring at him. He turned around many times, but there was no one. The familiar house now became like a dungeon. Every corner of me was potentially dangerous. In the afternoon, he opened his laptop, trying to find out about similar cases. On the forum, he read stories about creepy calls, about how if you hear yourself in the middle of the night, it means you accidentally opened the door to a spirit. Many people said that after those calls, they saw a figure that looked exactly like themselves appear in their house, and then disappear without a trace. James felt his insides turn cold, because every detail matched what he was going through. When I arrived, it was raining again. The sound of rain hitting the glass made a dark sound. James did not wake up, just sat quietly in his bedroom, the beer can still in his hand. The clock's hands slowly read 12 a.m. The phone started to vibrate. The screen showed a simple message: "I'm in the house." James put down the phone, feeling his whole body cold. But then, a light clicking sound rang out on the ceiling. He sat motionless, eyes slowly looking up. In the darkness, he clearly saw a shadow walking slowly on the ceiling, moving slowly then disappearing into the corner of me. He was bewildered, his heart pounding, his eyes about to explode. The phone sent another message: "We will meet tonight." James did not dare to open the door, did not dare to walk around the house. He sat down in the corner of the bed, feeling like he was just a newbie to something. Every clicking sound, every shadow became so creepy that it made him lose his ability to reason. At nearly 1 a.m., all the lights in the house were turned off. The bird's nest was completely blocked in the darkness. From within the darkness, a voice rang out clearly, his own voice: "It's time." James looked around, but saw only the shadow on the wall, like a reflection of himself, but strangely still. The shadow reached out as if to touch him. James stepped back, careful not to let it touch him. He knew that if he did, something would happen that he could not resist. He grabbed his phone, typed a text message to his own number. "What do you want from me?" And in just a few seconds, the screen lit up with the reply, "I want to be friends." It was almost 3 a.m. when James returned to the corner of the bed, falling asleep in his dark room. He didn't know how much longer he could endure. But then, before he fell asleep, he heard a voice right next to his ear. "My night has just begun." Episode 6 brought James to the edge of the wilderness, when his eyes and his clothes became one, making him no longer know who he was. Will reveal more terrifying signs about the parallel person who is pressing close to his eyes. James woke up in the morning with eyes that were as dark as a wolf's, his body as tired as a wolf after a battle. He knew he didn't have much time, because the promise from the messages was clear. Tonight was the night. In the apartment, the air was warm and cold, as if every wall was watching him. The truth was that James could no longer tell what was real and what was fake. Every step he took, he had to look behind him, because he always saw a figure like himself standing silently in the corner. Sometimes the figure did not move, but sometimes it smiled faintly and disappeared. Each time, James felt as if his soul was being sucked out of him piece by piece. That afternoon, he tried to gather his courage to leave the apartment, hoping to find peace on the street. But as soon as he stepped out into the hallway, he felt that it was not enough. The hallway was longer and quieter than usual, without a sound. James returned to his apartment, but when he closed the door, he saw a small piece of paper on the floor. It read clearly, "No need to call me tonight. I'll be here soon." James was almost feverish. His whole body was cold. He rubbed his head, his heart pounding, his head spinning. The images from the night before kept replaying in his head, his own voice saying, "It's time." When the sun came up, it was raining again. He turned off all the lights, cut the grass beside him, and sat in the dark waiting for something to happen. The clock's hands slowly ticked to 12 a.m. The phone on the table lit up, but this time it didn't vibrate, it didn't call. The screen just read, "I'm in the living room." James did not dare to go out, but he heard the sound of a chair on the floor. The sound of slow footsteps, the long sound of a chair, all as if someone was really moving around in his house. Sweat ran down his back. James lay down on the floor, pushed into the corner of the bed. The phone lit up again. A new message appeared. "I'm coming to your bedroom." He tried to lock the door, but his hands were shaking so much that he could not turn the key. The sound of a chair right outside the door rang out, slowly, then stopped abruptly and disappeared. James pressed his ear to the door, heard the following voice, exactly like his own, only different in that it was cold and empty dot. Suddenly, from the ceiling, a figure fell to the corner of the room. He saw clearly that the face was his own, but the eyes were empty, the smile was cold. The voice said, "Now you see the truth." James backed away, feeling the baseball, but his legs were frozen. The other shadow moved closer, closer until James could feel the cold breath. The phone on the table made a sound. A new recording automatically opened. James's voice came from inside. "This is not a story. This is reality. You cannot deny it." For a moment, everything was gone. Just him and the figure in the shadow. James no longer knew who he was, or who was the original. He felt his mind being drawn into the endless cycle of number 2. That night ended in a deafening silence. But James knew that this was only the beginning of the true scary stories that his life was about to endure. Not only does it send James into a state of extreme terror, but it also raises questions about the true nature of the cause. It goes deeper into whether the being appearing is another James from a parallel world. The next night, James no longer felt like himself. Every mirror in the apartment turned into a plane, because every time he looked, he clearly saw another James staring back at him with empty eyes. He had to cover the mirror with his shoulder. But that person was still present in the shadows in every corner of the house. Its presence was no longer just an illusion. The features of the house began to change position. The chair in the living room, the lamp on the ceiling, all seemed to be used by someone else. James felt like he was no longer the owner of this apartment, but only a temporary tenant in a space that had been invaded. At exactly 12 a.m., the phone lit up again. This time, the screen displayed the words, "I am not just a friend." James felt like he was losing me. He picked up the phone, trembling as he typed a text. "Who are you?" The answer came immediately. "I am everything you don't want to be." James picked up the phone, swallowed, his heart pounding. He turned toward the bedroom door and saw the figure standing still, as if waiting for a long time. The voice echoed around the room. "This is not a haunted story. This is your promise." James kept his hand on the baseball, but he couldn't get close enough. He saw the figure walking slowly, making no sound, leaving only a long shadow on the floor. When it got near the window, the outside light illuminated its face. It was him, but the smile stretched down to his ears. His eyes were empty and emotionless. James was confused. His body, but he realized something more terrifying. The figure didn't need a door. It simply passed through like a shadow and stood in the middle of the bedroom. James stepped back, his back touching the wall. The voice rang out coldly. "If you want to live, accept me to replace you." He shivered, feeling that somehow something invisible was sticking him closer, as if it wanted to merge with the shadow. James cried out in relief, his voice hoarse. "Why me?" The shadow only laughed in a weak voice. "Because only you accept me." At 2 a.m., the phone on the table started recording video. James looked at the screen in bewilderment, seeing the figure and himself sitting in the frame, as if they both existed in the same space, but not the same person. The voice from the video echoed out. "Only one of us will survive into the morning." James truly understands that he is being dragged into a battle between reality and his dreams, between the real person and the parallel figure. With each passing second, he feels himself getting weaker, being sucked deeper into the darkness. Here, the story reaches its climax when James is faced not only with the calls, but also with himself from a parallel world. The terrifying truth about the purpose of this figure and the end will be revealed if James cannot resist. Tonight, James could no longer find peace in any dark corner of the apartment. He sat on the floor, his phone in the middle of the room, the screen constantly lighting up with new words. This time, the message was clear. Only one of us will survive tomorrow morning. James read each word, feeling his insides turn cold. He understood that the person across from him did not just want to break his mind, but actually replace him. Tiny sounds began to appear. The sound of sticks on the floor, whispers behind his ear, laughter echoing from the corners of his eyes. All of them came from no one but the figure that looked exactly like his brother. He tried to be a rational man, reminding himself that it was all just a tired dream. But every time he looked at his shadow on the wall, he could clearly see that the shadow moved off course, not in sync with his actions. It walked slower, turned its head to look slower, and on its face, there was always a strange smile. At 12:30 a.m., a new recording came out of the phone. James shook as he picked it up. In the file was his voice, reading a simple sentence. "This is not a story, this is a curse." He felt his head spin. His mind was pushed into a second loop of doubt. If everything was a curse, would he ever have a chance to live? The shadow began to appear right in front of him, right in the bedroom. It didn't need to open the door. It just stood there, its clear eyes looking at him. James felt the bell, but his hands were shaking so much that he could not speak. The voice of the figure rang out. "If you do not accept, I will take everything." James drew closer and shouted, "Why me?" The figure laughed and replied, "Because you answered the call." In that moment, James understood that every action from the first night had led him to this ending. The midnight call was not just music, but a ritual to open the parallel figure to enter his world. He ran around the apartment, moving every door, but everything was useless. With each movement, the figure appeared before him again, as if it were not limited by space. When James returned to the bedroom, he clearly saw a new message on the phone. "You will not exist after this night." He fell to the floor, his mind as if it had been crushed. He understood that what was happening was no longer a fairy tale, but one of those true horror stories that no one wanted to believe. It was all a nightmare that he could not escape. At nearly 3 a.m., all sound had disappeared. The bird's nest was in a silent, hollow silence. James lay still, his sweat dripping, his eyes still in the dark. He knew he was alive, but he did not know who he was anymore. The figure might have replaced him, or maybe it was just waiting for the morning to end it all. Not only does this bring the story to its climax, but it also raises the question, did James forfeit his right to exist from the very first call? This question will continue to be answered as the boundary between the real James and the fake James is completely destroyed. James sat motionless in the bedroom, his eyes staring at his shadow standing still in the corner. He was afraid of the whole body. His every movement seemed to freeze. He knew that if he stayed still, he would be sucked deeper into this darkness. But running around wouldn't go anywhere. Even outside, there was only darkness and the faint call. The phone on the bedside table lit up, the screen displaying the words, "You are no longer you." James trembled, his heart pounding. He wanted to turn it off, but his fingers seemed unable to control it. The strange sound rang out. The voice was all his, but dark and empty. "I will take all your memories." James fell back to the floor, sweating like a maniac. He tried to run to the main door, but when he opened it, the long hallway disappeared. The darkness seemed to suck him in. Every step brought him closer to that shadow. He turned back to the bedroom, his heart pounding, the house feeling like a plane that could not escape in the darkness. The shadow walked slowly, as if it was stretching out time. Every time it looked at James, its eyes seemed to draw him in. James tried to resist, shouting, "Go away, this is my life." The shadows only smiled, looking around. "No, this is our life." At about 1 a.m., James discovered that all the mirrors in the house had turned on automatically. He saw himself in them, but each image was different. Some had dirty eyes, some had cold smiles, some were gloomy, and their bodies were covered with scars. All were different versions of James, standing still, looking out from the mirror. He trembled, his shoulders shaking. But the image immediately appeared on the phone screen. A new message appeared. Only one of us will survive tomorrow morning. James didn't know what to do anymore. Every sound outside seemed to make it clearer that his life would be decided only tonight. He sank into the corner of the bed, hugging the iron rod. The footsteps of the figure grew closer, clearer, then disappeared. The silence became deafening. James closed his eyes, hoping that it was all just a long dream. But then a voice rang out right next to his ear. His own voice. "In the morning, I will be the one to survive." James opened his eyes. Only darkness surrounded him. He didn't know if he was the real James anymore. It all became one of those creepy stories that never ended. Not only did it push James to the point of tragic truth, but it also raised the question, who is the real person and who is just a shadow? Which will take the story to a different direction when the boundary between James and the figure is completely destroyed. James sat in his bedroom, feeling as if the world around him was falling apart. Every mirror in the house showed different versions of himself, each image imperfect and shadowy. He could see a James with wide, emotionless eyes, a James with a small but hopeful smile, and another James who breathed like a man gasping for air. The phone on the table began to light up again. The title appeared clearly, "Choose Who Will Survive." James did not understand the meaning, but his heart felt like it was being torn apart. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling, and received a new recording. It sounded exactly like him, but many versions of himself saying the same thing. "You are not allowed to survive alone. Choose, or everything will end." James was about to turn off his phone when the screen automatically showed a live image from the camera. He saw himself sitting on the bed, but next to him was a shadowy figure, eyes clear, staring intently. His heart was pounding. The room was completely cold. The air was sucked out. He closed his eyes, wondering if it was all a dream. But the sounds around him were clear. The sound of sticks on the floor, the cold sound of breathing, the sound of laughter. When he opened his eyes, James saw the shadow of the other person sitting opposite him, laughing very softly. "Do you think I'm really James?" James ran around the room in confusion, feeling the baseball. But every time he opened the door, he saw only an empty hallway with no destination. Every door he opened led him back to his bedroom, as if he were trapped in a loop. The other ball laughed coldly. The sound of the circle. There is no way out, only choice. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, all the mirrors in the house were smashed into pieces. The sound of the bells pierced the space. The figures from the mirrors came out, forming a circle around him. Each session was a different James. Each pair of eyes stared at him. The phone on the floor lit up with the title, "It's Time." James was pushed into the middle of the circle, trying his best to shout, "I am the real James. You are not me." But all the voices answered back, "We are all James." The room shook. The shadows seemed to grow more numerous. Each session seemed to want to rush in and take him. He raised his stick, trying to play in the circle. Every thrust into the other person's shadow only made the air tremble and then stop. Finally, James fell to the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes closed. He did not know if he still existed or had been replaced. Everything became obscure. Only the voice echoed, "Tomorrow morning. Only one of us will survive." Here the story reaches its climax. When James is surrounded by many of his other selves and forced to choose who will survive. Let's explore the consequences if James does not make a timely choice. James woke up in a room full of shadows and invisible figures. He didn't know when he fell asleep, only that when he opened his eyes, the other sessions were still standing around, silent as ghostly walls. They all looked at him with empty eyes. He wondered if he was still himself, or if he had long been replaced. The phone on the floor lit up with a new message: "Your time is running out." James picked up the phone, his heart pounding, not daring to look at the screen anymore. He knew if this continued, he would lose everything. The voices around him did not leave him alone. Every session started to laugh. The laughter echoed throughout the room, creating the feeling that there were hundreds of people present. He stood there, feeling the baseball, looking at each session. "I am the real James," he said hoarsely. But everyone answered in unison, "No, I am James." The sound echoed through the space, filling the room with chaos. James was stunned. His body felt like it was about to explode. At 1 a.m., all the figures suddenly disappeared. The room was left with only him and the shattered mirror. James almost fell asleep because the sudden silence was more terrifying than the laughter. He wondered if he had one. But a moment later, the phone lit up with a recording. It was his voice, but this time steady and clear. "It is only the beginning. You have made a choice, but the choice is not yours." James shivered, swallowed hard, feeling cold all over. He remembered the paranormal stories he had heard, that if you saw multiple versions of yourself at the same time, it meant you were being invaded by a parallel force. That meant only one spirit was allowed to exist, and the rest were invisible. At nearly 2 a.m., James walked to his own door with the intention of running away from his apartment. But when he opened the door, what he saw was not the familiar hallway, but a dark, endless void. A voice echoed from the shadows: "If you go out, you will disappear forever." He backed away, closing the door, his heart pounding. He turned back to the bedroom. All the figures reappeared, but this time they were silent, not laughing. A version came closer, handing him the phone. On the screen, the last words appeared: "Tomorrow morning, only me." James fell to the floor, feeling like his mind was about to disappear. He didn't know if he really had the right to exist anymore. It was all just an invisible game that he had no choice in. Episode 12 not only pushed James into a situation with no way out, but also opened up the question of who is the soul that is truly allowed to exist, which will continue to take the story to the heart. When James enters the final game with his parallel self, James felt like he was living in a horror movie, but no one could turn it off. Every time he opened his eyes, the space around him was different, as if his apartment had become a motion picture without laughter. Shadows moved on the wall like distorted images, faint, but more real than anything. The phone on the floor lit up, the message displayed: "The final game has begun." James was almost powerless, but he knew he had to stay awake. He picked up the phone. A cold voice said, "If you want to survive, or survive after this night." Immediately, all the shadows in the room moved. They moved around James, each shadow like a cut-and-paste version of an animated horror story, but more haunting than the rest. There were big balloons, some pale balloons, some just staring at him without blinking. James was lost in the strange images. He felt the balloons, tried to fight them, but every effort only made the air shake and die. My balloons were not damaged. On the contrary, they became clearer and clearer. Voices from all the balloons said, "You cannot break this program. You can only be a character." James was confused, his heart pounding. But then he saw a bright window on the other side of the room. He ran towards it, hoping that it was an escape. But when he opened the door, all he saw was a blank screen, as if he had just stepped into another frame. The phone rang again, and the screen showed, "Do you want to be a survivor or a disappearer?" He answered tremblingly, his voice hoarse, "I want to live." All the figures disappeared. The room was left with only James and the silence. He felt a faint hope return, but his heart beat faster than ever, because he knew the worst was yet to come. At 3 a.m., a figure finally appeared. Not one of the hundreds of figures anymore, but a single figure. It stood still, its eyes were empty, holding the phone in its hand. The screen showed, "Tomorrow morning, only me." James did not know if he still had the ability to fight. His entire life has become a pre-programmed horror show, a set of animated horror stories that are happening in the present. He knows that tomorrow morning, the answer will be revealed, who really exists. Episode 13 not only reveals the terrifying truth that James is just a character in a dark game, but also raises the question, did he lose control from the very first call that will take the story? Further, as the game enters its conclusion, James felt like he was living in a horror movie, but no one could turn it off. Every time he opened his eyes, the space around him was different, as if his apartment had become a motion picture without laughter. Shadows moved on the wall like distorted images, faint, but more real than anything. The phone on the floor lit up, the message displayed, "The final game has begun." James was almost powerless, but he knew he had to stay awake. He picked up the phone. A cold voice said, "If you want to survive, or survive after this night." Immediately, all the shadows in the room moved. They moved around James, each shadow like a cut-and-paste version of an animated horror story, but more haunting than the rest. There were big balloons, some pale balloons, some just staring at him without blinking. James was lost in the strange images. He felt the balloons, tried to fight them, but every effort only made the air shake and die. My balloons were not damaged. On the contrary, they became clearer and clearer. Voices from all the balloons said, "You cannot break this program. You can only be a character." James was confused, his heart pounding. But then he saw a bright window on the other side of the room. He ran towards it, hoping that it was an escape. But when he opened the door, all he saw was a blank screen, as if he had just stepped into another frame. The phone rang again, and the screen showed, "Do you want to be a survivor or a disappearer?" He answered tremblingly, his voice hoarse, "I want to live." All the figures disappeared. The room was left with only James and the silence. He felt a faint hope return, but his heart beat faster than ever, because he knew the worst was yet to come. At 3 a.m., a figure finally appeared. Not one of the hundreds of figures anymore, but a single figure. It stood still, its eyes were empty, holding the phone in its hand. The screen showed, "Tomorrow morning, only me." James did not know if he still had the ability to fight. His entire life had become a pre-programmed horror show, a set of animated horror stories that were happening in the present. He knew that tomorrow morning, the answer would be revealed. Who really existed? Episode 13 not only revealed the terrifying truth that James was just a character in a shadowy game, but also raised the question, had he lost control of himself from the very beginning? James sat motionless in his bedroom, all the windows and his own door closed. He held the baseball in his hand, his ears always listening for any sound. His apartment was no longer a familiar place, but had become a prison with every wall seemingly having a face. watching his every move. He wondered if he had to pay the price for answering that first midnight call. Life now felt like a never-ending banter. The phone on the table lit up, but this time it didn't vibrate. It just read, "You're never really alone." James felt a chill in his gut. The music seemed to be taunting his fragile spirit. He thought of the stories others had told about home alone, about hearing footsteps when home alone, or seeing shadows on empty windows. Now he was experiencing all those feelings, but in a much more intense form. Every corner of the house seemed to be filled with an invisible creature, ready to pounce at any moment. At 1 a.m., James heard the sound of dripping water from the bathroom. He knew he was drowning, but the sound was long, slow, and steady. He walked to the door of the bathroom, but only saw the large mirror reflecting his image. The terrible thing was that the reflection was so faint that he stood still outside. James frantically kicked the mirror, shaking himself to pieces, then ran to the bedroom. The futility was clear. The phone lit up again with a new message. "Mirror is only for you." James felt like he was being surrounded by invisible forces, waiting for him to open them. He curled up in his knees, trying not to look at any of the reflections anymore. The sound of tapping outside lit up the room for a moment, and in the other space, James clearly saw a figure sitting at the end of the bed. When I returned, the shadow had disappeared, but James knew for sure he wasn't imagining things. The cold breath still lingered in the air. He turned to his phone. This time the screen displayed the words, "I'll be in your room tomorrow morning." James was almost exhausted, falling to the floor. He no longer knew who he was, or who was real. Every second in this home alone apartment only brought him closer to the end, put James in a state of suffocation. When the invisible presence confirmed that he was never really alone, we'll go further into another circle. Face to face, when James was forced to choose between existing or disappearing. The first call will bring the story to... James sat quietly on the floor, his back against the wall, his hands still feeling the bice. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall. The steady rain falling, creating a clear and steady music. Before, the sound always helped him sleep, but now it became a ringing call, as if forewarning of something to come. The phone on the table lit up again, the screen showing, "This location no longer belongs to you." James felt a chill in his gut, swallowed, not daring to touch the screen. He knew that if he answered, the spirit might take everything he had left. The sounds outside the door became strange again. In the midst of the rain, James clearly heard footsteps, steady and clear, as if someone was walking on his own floor. He stood up, his heart pounding, and turned around the apartment, but saw no one. But each time the lights set, someone's shadow appeared on the wall, stared at him, then disappeared. James returned to his bedroom. All the doors were closed. He curled up in his knees, hoping the sound of rain would drown everything. But then the rain began to change into something else. Among the sounds of the rain, he heard a whisper, like hundreds of people talking at the same time. He pressed his ear to the window and suddenly recognized the voices as his own. Different versions, some laughing, some shouting, some whispering, "I will come, I have come." He opened the window, but the rain began to pour into the house, even though the door was closed. The house was wet. The silhouette of a person appeared more clearly in the frozen water. James was confused. He backed away, but then the phone vibrated strongly. The screen showed clearly, "Tomorrow morning, I will sit in your position." James picked up the phone, his heart pounding. He no longer knew if he could survive the night. Every second in the house filled with the sound of rain and cold laughter only confirmed one thing. He was not alone. At nearly 3 a.m., everything suddenly became silent. The sound of rain also disappeared, as if it had never existed. The house was left with only a quiet, dark atmosphere. James sat still, confused, not knowing what was waiting. He understood that the battle was not over. It was just a preparation for a more terrifying ending. Puts James in a desperate situation, where even the voice of the dead becomes a tool of fear. This takes the story to a new level, when James is forced to face the spirit that wants to replace him. James felt as if he were being sucked into an invisible loop. Everything around him no longer followed any rules. The room changed shape. Sometimes it was as long as an endless corridor. Sometimes it was so narrow that he could barely sit clearly. On the table, the phone continued to light up. The screen displaying the words, "Your soul is mine." James felt a sense of dread, but this time it was as sharp as a useless device. He realized that his opponent was not material, but an invisible force that controlled everything. He tried to resist with his will, closing his eyes, reminding himself that he was still James, a real person alive. The voices that filled the space began to increase, saying in unison, "You have lost control." Outside the window, the light from the sky clearly revealed the silhouette of him standing at the end of the bed. When I returned, the shadow had disappeared, but the cold breath still lingered. James pressed his back against the wall, his heart pounding. He knew that if he didn't look away, he would be completely swallowed up. At exactly 1 a.m., the phone rang. On the screen was no longer the familiar text mother calling, but instead, "You're ready." James looked up, but then pressed the answer button. The voice rang out like his own, deep and golden. "Look away from me if you want to survive." Suddenly, the other person's shadow appeared clearly before him. This time, not just a shadow, but a real body. James saw himself, his face pale, his eyes wide, his mouth long. The shadow drew closer, and the whole room seemed to shake with each step it took. James had no way back now. He drew all his strength and jumped to attack. The baseball struck the figure's shoulder, but it made no sound, only a cold wind. The shadow laughed, its voice echoing, "Matter can't do anything." He was confused, but he didn't give up. He shouted, his voice echoing, "I'm the real James." The shadow looked him straight in the eye and replied, "No, you're just a story." In that moment, James felt his mind disappear. He realized his existence was just a part of a long creepypasta, and someone else was trying to make him a replacement character. What he thought was reality could only be a story being written somewhere by 3 a.m. Everything was quiet. The other figure was gone, leaving only James lying on the floor, breathing heavily. The phone lit up again, the title clearly visible. Next episode will be the last game. James knew he wasn't out of chances, but it would be much harsher. Not only would it deepen James's fears, but it would also raise the question, if he were just a character in a creepypasta, who was directing the story that would bring it to a climax when James would be faced with the most terrifying answer? James could no longer stand the apartment that had become his shadow's home. After nights of being haunted by phone calls and shadows of people like him, he decided to leave. In the middle of the rainy night, he picked up his small backpack, his phone, and the bell tower and rushed out. The streets were quiet, the rain was fading away. Every step seemed to be sucked into a never-ending cycle. He ran out of the house, looking for a safe place. In his mind, he thought that if he left the apartment, he might be able to cut off his fortune. But every step only took him deeper into his fears. After more than 30 minutes of running in the rain, James realized that he had strayed into a dark forest. The rain rustled under the rain. The sound of rain falling on the roof made a clear sound. The sounds did not bring a sense of peace, but became a warning. James felt like he was going through a special camping night, but instead of the quiet nature, all there was darkness and an invisible presence. He stopped, breathed deeply, and leaned his back against the tree trunk. The phone lit up again. The message displayed, "You cannot run from me." James accidentally threw the phone into the water, but the screen remained lit, as if something was keeping it alive. The shadow of a person began to appear in the forest, following his every step. As the light increased, James clearly saw a figure that looked like him walking between the roots of the tree. It did not run, only walked slowly, but each step shortened the distance. James was confused, running deeper into the forest, the rain hitting his eyes, making him lose his sense of direction. He found a temporary shelter, a large stone under a tree. He crouched down, curling up like a person camping at night. But unlike normal camping, all around him were whispers and shadows. Voices echoed throughout the space. "If you run, I will follow. If you stand, I will come." James no longer had enough strength. He put his back to the forest, closed his eyes, hoping that the rain would take everything away. But then, the phone rang again. The screen showed, "Time to go, choose here." He felt a chill in his gut, because he understood that this escape was just part of the other person's plan. Near 3 a.m., the rain began to ease. James opened his eyes and saw the figure sitting opposite him, only a few steps away, silently watching him. The whole forest became strangely silent. Only the deep breathing and the eyes in that forest took James out of the room, but did not escape the curse, but only trapped him in a larger space, but still surrounded by fear. It will go further into direct life when James enters the final battle in the forest. James sank into the corner, the rain running down his coffin, his whole body trembling. He thought that leaving the room would escape the curse, but unexpectedly, this forest was even more terrifying. Every shadow seemed to have a shadow. Every wind seemed to carry a faint laugh. He raised his hands to cover his ears, but the whispers kept echoing, "You will never escape." The phone in his hand lit up again. The name displayed, "Only one person is allowed to exist." James swallowed his tears, his heart pounding. He knew that the other pair of eyes could not be denied. In the next moment, he saw the shadow of the person standing in the middle of the forest, staring at him with clear eyes. It was no longer just a shadow, but a real person, a haunted spirit that held the essence of control. James stood there, feeling the baseball, absorbing all the strength in his eyes. "I am the real James. This is my life." He was gone in the rain. The other ball only laughed, echoing throughout the space. "No, I am the one who will survive." No steps came closer, making no sound on the dark floor. James stepped back, his back against the tree, but he understood that there was no way back. All that remained was a battle. Either survive or disappear. In that moment of blinking, James realized that the most terrible thing was not to be killed, but to be erased, to be replaced by another version of himself. It was a death without a mark, without a trace, only disappearance. He stretched out, rushed forward. The blow hit the other figure, but only created a cold wind. The figure was not harmed, only laughed louder. The voice echoed, Matter cannot harm the soul. James was confused, but did not give up. He finally hugged the phone and said, "I am the real James." The phone lit up. The screen showed a choice: exist or disappear. James raised his trembling finger to the screen, but before he could touch it, the other figure placed its hand on his shoulder. The cold feeling spread. His heart seemed to stop beating. He fell to the ground, his mind blurred in the last moment. James clearly heard his own voice echo, "Tomorrow morning, I will be the only one left." He did not know if he was the one who survived, or if the haunted spirit had taken over his life. Everything was in darkness. Not only does it put James in a life and death situation, but it also raises the question: has the spirit that replaced him all along discovered the terrifying truth that will haunt him tonight? James opened his eyes. He found himself lying on the floor of his old apartment. The rain outside the window had stopped. He could see the early morning light. But everything was wrong. The room inside was colder, the objects were badly broken, and there were marks on the table as if someone had spent a long night there. He wondered if he had really returned, or if this was just another layer of his shirt. His heart was pounding. All the memories of the night in his mind were still clear. The figure that looked like him, the eyes, and the last words, "Tomorrow morning, only I will remain." James stood up, looked into the mirror on the wall. The reflection that appeared was clearly his own, but the eyes looked back into the deep without emotion. He was terrified and hit the mirror, shaking his head to pieces. The phone on the table lit up. The screen read, "You're alive, but who are you?" James felt a chill in his gut. If he was alive, had the other person disappeared, or was it taking over his life? He didn't know the answer. The morning passed slowly. James went out into the street. People were still walking around as if nothing had happened. But in everyone's eyes, he saw a coldness. Some stared at him longer, some fought to look straight at him. James knew something was wrong, but he couldn't name it. I arrived. The doorbell went off into the familiar darkness. He tried to convince himself that the game was over. But at 12 a.m., the phone lit up again, this time without vibrating. Just reading, "The game isn't over." James fell to the floor, his heart pounding. He wondered if he was just continuing the other's story. A voice from all over the room echoed, "You have chosen, but the choice is not yours." James was passive, his whole body cold. He knew that tonight was just the beginning of another loop. A long game that would never end. Not only questioned James's true existence, but also revealed the terrifying truth. The survivor was only a version that was kept. This would be the end, where all would be answered and James's fate decided. James woke up in his apartment, sweat dripping down his back. He turned around and looked around, everything familiar yet so foreign. The pictures on the wall were crooked. The table and chairs looked as if someone had used them the night before. He wondered if he was really alive, or just another person taking his form. The phone on the table lit up, but this time there was no message. Only a simple sentence appeared: "It's not over." James felt his heart pound. His eyes blurred for a moment. He wondered if this was relief or just another repetition of the curse. He walked to the mirror, hoping to see a familiar reflection. The reflection that came back was not smiling, not like himself, eyes empty, as if there were no soul. James hit the mirror, the glass flying everywhere. But in each fragment, he saw many different versions of himself staring at him. The sound of a knock outside the window, and in another circle, James saw the figure standing right behind him. He did not turn, but he could clearly feel the cold breath. The voice echoed from all over the space. "Do you think the story ends here?" James trembled, trying to resist, but the voice continued. "Every midnight, every call will start this game again. There is no end, only repetition." He fell to the floor, swallowed, knowing that it was all just a long repetition. He could survive today, but by the next midnight, it would all begin again. Outside the window, the sky was light. He saw the early morning and entered the room, but instead of peace, he felt only more afraid. Because James understood that he was just a controlled character in a game that had no chance of ending. The phone lit up for the last time, showing the message, "See you at midnight." James felt all hope was crushed. He no longer knew if he was the one who really survived or just a ghost. All that remained was silence and the promise of a scarier new night. The story ended, but also opened a terrifying question. Was the midnight call an endless curse where no one could escape? The next episode of this story will never end, because it only calls you at 12 a.m. to continue.